Hello, everyone, and welcome to the War Report. Now we have quite an episode ahead of us. A lot of news out of the woodwork this week, and of course, there's Syria, there's Libya, there's the tangents involving some more NATO infighting. I can't believe we haven't seen that one before. It never happened. On a related note, I wonder when the next NATO summit is. But again, I imagine we'll find out. Maybe I missed. But point being is, and then we have a lot of news on Israel and Russia this week. Unrelated news items, but they're probably going to be the bulk of the show. Uh, Probably about hour 15 minutes you're looking forward to. We have another special episode we're going to record specifically on the riots and protests, focusing on those in particular after this. But without further ado, let's get into the actual news into Syria. Now, Syria has heated up a little again, and this is mainly near Idlib. So the brief quiet we got in Idlib is no more. There's been fighting, as you can see on the map. There's been Kurdish operations in northern Syria, and according to South Front, it looks like there may be a confrontation between Turkish and Syrian forces. And then that's on top of the establishment of a new Russian patrol. You see that red castle-looking icon in the corner in northeastern Syria. So it looks like these things are coming to a head. And just when we thought Turkey was cutting its losses on Syria and pulling out and hanging their hat on that, perhaps what they did in Libya emboldened them. Perhaps their victories gave them new wind behind their sails to the point where they feel more confident to try to attempt an operation in Syria. Even though there's been no new territorial incursion, they are on the border. Syrian forces are going to confront them. Whether that will actually lead to a hot war exchange in actual exchange between Syrian and Turkish forces, or whether it's just going to be a standoff, time will tell. Because the most recent report is from a couple hours ago, so that's the information we have on that in particular in Syria. No news regarding Israeli actions in Syria beyond there was a spy plane, as you can see on the map, spotted off the coast of Syria, suspected to be Israeli, could be pretty much any country, but it's suspected to be of one of the quote unquote coalition countries or Israel. So there is that. So not much substantive has happened, but it is going in that direction.
Yeah, there's been a buildup, and so there's an anticipated battle that's to take place in the northeast section of Syria. This is just outside the zone that Turkey took over during, I believe it was 2017 or late 2016, the Turkish Spring or whatever it was called. Um, Now, the Syrians do face regular shelling by the Turks, but tanks, T-62s, supply trucks, other trucks holding missiles, anti-air missiles, have been spotted. So we're expecting some kind of a showdown. If not, then I would suggest that that is there to counter the ongoing strikes by the Turks. Uh, Ironically, the full length of the M4 in Greater Idlib was crossed by the Turks and the Russians, which is hilarious, all things considered. There have been attacks that killed one Syrian uh, soldier and injured several other people and soldiers on the border with Lebanon, which was unexpected. And there was a small village that was lost in Daraa, which I'm going to expect the Syrians will mount an attack to take it back. So again, we're seeing uh, basically resources being stretched to the limit. Russia has responded with more air attacks, and they're increasing air attacks. They've promised to do so with respect to Daraa and other areas that are just south of the Euphrates, on the south bank of the Euphrates. Uh, this goes also with another airport that Russia is building in the Latakia area. It may be the original airport, but it will probably receive an extra runway, maybe more. Um, so, yeah, Russia isn't going anywhere. Uh, that to me looks like that they've decided to continue helping Syria. We talked about this the last week about the impact of American sanctions and how they're hurting the average Syrian with skyrocketing prices for food. And, all things considered, the amount of effort that Iran and Russia have put in, even China and uh, Hezbollah have put in, it doesn't seem like they're willing to just let this go. And we're kind of seeing signs that uh, more responsibilities are taken in to thwart these attempts. So, I mean, that's good news. We'll see where it goes from there. But yeah, I don't have too much else from Syria except that.
Now, just continuing on that, as you said, the sanctions are really coming down the pipe now, and that is to stifle the reconstruction of Syria. And of course, the continued fighting also stifles the reconstruction. And what I'm actually making of these Turkish moves right now, and time will tell, this is all just speculation. I think they see the situation on the ground. They've shown their willingness to cooperate with Russia and the Syrian government before. They're trying to wedge themselves in a position where they can have a good bargaining chip or two at the negotiation tables so they can bring a relative end to this conflict in northwestern Syria and then also participate in the reconstruction while also having still that smallest amount of leverage in Syria with a I wouldn't call it a buffer state but a buffer zone on the border.
Hmm. Yeah, I would agree.
And of course there has been more reports of the assassination of military and intelligence officers. As you can see on the map, resurgent ISIS attacks with the you can probably see the black cloud of smoke on the map, and of course the patches they still have there. So more of the same. It's just that with these recent moves with Turkey, something is going to happen, whether that's diplomatic, whether that's military, and this these next few months, next few weeks, next few months are probably going to be some of the most decisive, I would say, since 2017, since the fall of ISIS as a territorial caliphate, as many people would put it. I think we're coming up on something that's going to rival the significance of that with the fate of Idlib, northeastern Syria slash the Kurdish SDF controlled zones, and the reconstruction of Syria. I think we're looking forward to that in the next few months, over the summer, over the fall.
Yeah, it's crunch time, right? I mean, I think this even ties in with the latest fake news about Russians trying to incentivize, as if the Taliban aren't already incentivized to kill American soldiers for nearly 20 years. Um, yeah, so I think to me, both stories kind of reflect like a crunch time that um, America, like geopolitical America, is is asking basically for public support to reinvest in these conflict zones indefinitely. I think that's what it's about. And so the harsher measures are coming out, the ones that they didn't want to do at the start for reasons of bad press.
Yeah, and
Um,
just in general. But I do have one last question I'll pose to you on Syria. Do you think the reason they're in crunch time is not that Trump has been much better, but he's been more restrained on it now, whether that be for actual his personal reasons, the goals of administration, or just pragmatic reasons? Do you think the specifically the pro-Assad forces and even to a degree Turkey fear a Biden victory may unravel what has been done in Syria?
yeah, I think so. You're right. Turkey and other countries have, and and Russia have certainly benefited from Trump in office. Like, the libs are right about that, because
Just
of
for
the
the
lack
wrong
of a
reasons.
yeah, yes. I mean, he is literally tearing down the empire. Um, so yeah, I would agree that he has his indecisiveness, or actually, it's not so much indecisiveness. He seems to get frustrated and demand that the troops be removed. Someone talks them into staying, so he has a smaller number, or he shifts them into another area. But essentially, the message is that America is weakening, and so that has bolstered the confidence of, say, a country like Turkey. I mean, everyone can imagine how it would bolster the confidence of Russia, but Turkey is a more complex case because it's a NATO country. Its ambitions and its desire to do certain things would be in contradiction to American foreign policy and NATO. And so Trump has given them actually a more unique opportunity in many ways than he has to, say, Russia or to Syria. All of them have benefited in one way or another, right? 4 American bases have been closed just in the last 3 months
American
in
patrols are
Iraq, for
chased
instance.
around on the daily. I've made
Yeah,
this point before. Is it, if for the people concerned about America's international reputation, is it more embarrassing to be completely evacuated from the country or be chased around like dogs? In my opinion, I think ineffective force is worse than no force, and that's even
right.
debating whether we should even be there in the first place. But another point I do want to make is I don't think Biden will go full regime change. I doubt it'll be Libya or he'll try to bomb Assad. Okay, maybe a few cruise missiles here and there over chemical attacks or other so-called human rights abuses or whatever they drum up. But I do think a Biden administration would throw their full weight behind the Kurds, especially with how much the Democrats and the left and the establishment really took up the cause of the Kurds of the SDF after Trump quote unquote abandoned them in last October.
Yes, and also we shouldn't forget, like, some of these other leaks, these phone leaks that have come out, for instance, about I think Carl Bloomberg was on CNN, and he had mentioned that it was actually Erdogan who had requested that the Americans leave Syria. That's interesting. You know, I mean, we all know why, because he wanted to deal directly with the Kurds, and he wanted this area where the Kurds could not cross one border into another, and so on. But that was, unheard of, and in that sense, you could argue, from a purely NATO point of view, that was a dumb move on Trump's part, right? Because, I mean, who knows? The Kurds are a resilient bunch. No matter how many times that they've been abandoned by the U.S., they still seem to come back. So I wouldn't.
Resilient or battered
I
wives.
yes, I wouldn't want to guess, but they're not a monolith. There are some that are in Iraq that have different goals than the ones in Syria. There are ones that will never work with the Syrians. There are ones that have been working with the Syrians for over a year. So it's I mean most Westerners find it confusing, and understandably so. Um, but I would say that would be an example. And yeah, so Biden might go back to the old routine, the routine that preceded um, Trump, the one that was in place during the Obama years. I think that's even basically the selling point of Biden as the next president of the United States, is that he's going to have that little bit of the Obama years continue and act as a bookend, to the 4 Trump years, right? They're going to go back to normal, as it were. Now, does that mean that he's willing to go to war with Russia? At the moment, I don't think so. Primarily because he'll have a very divided country when and if he's elected, anyways, right?
Yeah, a Biden victory would be a chance for the neoliberals, for the empire, so to speak, to get back on its feet. They wouldn't be in a position to make any proactive or offensive moves like that. They wouldn't be able to go into Syria. They wouldn't be able to influence what's going on in Libya to the degree they may have been able to under Obama or Bush. But because of Trump's, again, Trump hasn't done much concrete, but he has been a destabilizing force in many ways. Just to, I would say, recover from the uh, hurricane that was Trump, they wouldn't be able to take any of those sort of proactive moves that they otherwise would want to take.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the first step with the Biden administration is to create some kind of coherency of foreign policy. That will be there. Now, does that mean they're going to increase troop presence? Well, based on what I've seen from CSIS, from the Atlantic Council, no, not necessarily. They're talking about deeper ties through negotiation and friendship.
Yeah, they're going to take the very Obama era multilateral approach, as conservatives somewhat accurately called it back in the day, the lead from behind approach, sort of the plausible deniability empire approach.
Yeah, I think if he gets in, I think we should expect America to start doing drone attacks.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
unironically think that. Now, it will depend like what happens and what the sentiment will be. And this is also part of like, fake news about Russia is that if they're going to do that, if they're going to commit to that, um, they've already established that Russia in Syria is really Trump in Syria, and it's really Trump along with Assad, with the murderous regime, and that the freedom fighters are like they're the people of Chaz in the Middle East, so to speak. Um, so that's the narrative that they're going to spin, obviously, right? That was the narrative that they spun, essentially, with some of these details being slightly different when Obama was in power. So I'm going to presume that if they want to still keep Syria, they are going to have to more forcefully lead from behind. And I would suspect that they would use drones. Now, obviously, Russia or Syria or both are going to knock out some of these drones. If that happens, then we're going to have an escalation, right? And then from there on, one will have to guess what will happen.
Or they'll
Uh,
outsource their air defenses to Hezbollah or other militia groups for the plausible deniability. Oh, Hezbollah shot down the drone, not the SAA. To go focus on Lebanon, not us.
that's right. Bad Hezbollah, bad Hezbollah.
Yeah.
So that's what I see happening.
Yeah. I definitely agree. And just to put this little tangent in there because I don't know where else to put it. Of course, there was the story about Russia was offering the Taliban bounties on American soldiers, which, look, we've heard these kind of stories before. Great powers do fund proxy groups to fight each other. The Russians have done it, we've done it, everyone's done it. Any country that has been able to project force outside its borders has outsourced fighting its rivals to another country. But the particular picture they're painting right now makes no sense because some assassinations on U.S. foot soldiers isn't going to wedge them out of Afghanistan. They're not going to do the Vietnam thing where they even collect the nearly the same amount of casualties they had in the Vietnam War because again that's the idea, that's the narrative they're trying to paint. But you also look at US casualties in Afghanistan. They peaked around 2010 to 2012, like around a decade into the war, and have tapered off since, to the point where most troops deployed in Afghanistan are technically in a combat zone but don't see much active combat. And again, they play this up, and according to Michael Tracy, who's usually pretty good on this kind of stuff, after a series of leaks designed to make withdrawing from Afghanistan look like a capitulation to Russia, the House overwhelmingly voted yes on the amendment to restrict Trump's ability to withdraw from Afghanistan. Uh, More Republicans actually voted no than Democrats. So that's an interesting thing, but apparently what they didn't tell you is this all precedes a debate on further withdrawal from Afghanistan. So it makes sense. Hype that up. Not only do we need to secure
Mm.
Afghanistan, we need to fight our great power rival in Afghanistan. So they really drummed that up, and it's no surprise. And seeing as how little this has taken off, I don't even think Trump has addressed it outright. It's probably going to be forgotten pretty quickly. They're going to sweep it under the rug because it did not have the intended effect. It didn't have any effect at all. Beyond some liberal journalists and liberal pundits, nobody really cared.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a foreign policy issue. I remember watching Bolton before he was fired argue, and even after he was fired, argue why, and this includes various, prestigious, established journalists, other analysts with the American military, former U.S. military, suggest why America has to stay indefinitely in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, like absolutely indefinitely. Excuses were made like, well, I mean, the British were over a century in India. My God, we've only been there for 20 years.
Oh yeah, Max Boot's piece from last May talking about, oh, we
Right,
can do it. We just need a few more centuries beyond our entire lifetimes in an era where nobody thinks into the next 10 years, let alone their grandchildren's lives. We can do it, definitely. We have the wherewithal
right.
of the great colonial powers of Europe. And yeah, but continue.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's what this whole hit piece was about. I mean, I doubt it's going to sway a lot of people who are already on Trump's side away from Trump. Um, that isn't going to be the issue. I think people who support Trump, who may not support Trump, they're going to migrate, and that's going to be because of the riots and the looting and the violence because of following the BLM protests.
Yeah, there's
So
way too many pertinent things, whether that be the COVID stuff, whether that be the
yeah,
riots, whether that be the economy, that are going to take precedent in this election over a multitude of foreign policy issues, which, yes, in the long term may be important in terms of what direction America, or what's left of America, I should say, what direction it should go. But in terms of electorate, in terms of the way democracy functions, most people understandably are going to be focused on, okay, where's my next paycheck coming from? When are the police going to bring order? Or maybe from the more liberal perspective, okay, when are we going to rein in the police or whatever? But point being is, people are going to focus on these things that affect them directly in the short term before they even venture to think about the long term or the world at large.
right, right. So I think these um, I suppose protagonists within the American military and media and the places where they converge, they might have all kinds of ideas why they think they're brilliant ideas, but in many ways they have misunderstood the mind of a lot of Trump supporters. Sometimes they've been wrong, sometimes they've been right, but I do think they want a kind of maximum effect in a multifaceted way as a criticism of Trump. Of course, we know that he's has to be delegitimized on a daily basis, even if that ends up kind of delegitimizing the press itself. That's going to continue regardless. And so, yeah, the bottom line is it's not going to really dissuade, because a lot of people will find it very difficult to believe why the Taliban would need incentivizing. They killed 19 or 15 US soldiers, I believe, in 2019, and they killed three in, from January to February, but they've killed none from February till July.
Yeah,
So,
and it also, you look at Russia's posturing in Afghanistan, the people they align themselves with is the current central government in Kabul, and to a much lesser degree, some of the Shia groups the Iranians support. So, they seem to have an anti-Taliban stance because, again, even the Taliban, say what you will about them, again, whether you think that, oh, they finally brought stability to Afghanistan, or whether they were just a retrograde terrorist force ruling the country, whatever, sort of irrelevant to the point I'm trying to make here. But point being is, Russia's goals do not align with the Taliban. The Taliban is a very isolationist, autarkic sort of group. If they controlled the country, they would do everything in their power to keep everyone out of Afghanistan. So even as an enemy of my enemy sort of thing, uh, their reluctance to I would say they'd probably be reluctant to support them and more likely to opt for, again, either the central government or some of these groups that were formerly of the Northern Alliance that involve a lot of Shia groups backed by Iran, a lot of more, I guess, moderate, relatively Sunni Islam groups. And yeah, so the story doesn't add up for several reasons. Like I said, I don't put it past great powers to antagonize each other in that way, but this particular case makes no sense.
Yeah, it's actually kind of funny, and it's there really to also, you know, energize the Democrat base, you know, because the Democrats really are now in charge of America, like in every possible way. I would say that, well, yes, Bush era Republicans definitely are on the same page with um, mainline Democrats with regards to geopolitics and the empire and so on.
Yeah, but
Uh,
just about the only area conservatives are allowed to take charge is foreign policy, and like, that's of course
yeah,
the neoconservatives, or big business issues where we'll give this multinational corporation another tax cut while while they outsource our jobs, that sort of stuff. But any of the social issues, any of the other more practical economic issues, such as, I don't know, maybe lower taxes for the American public, or any of these more pragmatic conservative proposals, will be shot down. And these are the couple concessions they've been given, and they will defend them to their last breath, as you see with the mainstream conservative establishment of not only the United States but the Anglosphere and Western world at large.
right. And it's kind of like when Trump proclaimed that the job of the Pentagon going forward will be to legalize gay marriage in every country all over the world.
Oh, interesting you brought that up because uh, the I, the New York Times put out some article like everyone corroborates the claim about Russia funding the Taliban except Trump, Putin, and the Taliban. And what's funny is even Pentagon officials came out and debunked the story. So that may be some inter-service rivalry we're seeing between the intelligence agencies such as the CIA and of course their subsidiaries in the media and whatever, and the more hardline military types in the Pentagon. So it again, we may be seeing the infighting of the empire
Yeah,
brought out to light.
that's a possibility. Also, I'm sure they're thinking, will RT come up with like a funny, ironic video about the U.S. claiming this? They'll drudge up the Mujahideen in 1979. They'll
McCain
say,
in Syria in 2011, all these different things, all these
right.
things that are very easy to find, but RT
It's
just
very low
excels.
hanging fruit what they're
Yeah,
offering. To rebut this, it will be very easy, and I'm sure they're afraid of that blowback, and so now they'll essentially nip that in the bud and ensure that the story is quickly forgotten. Right? It does enough outrage amongst the Democrats, amongst the liberal redditors who every day are complaining that Trump is killing them with COVID-19, or they're suddenly patriotic and really militaristic now. And they're concerned about the lives of military men who will never leave Afghanistan.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's
All,
all
all these people they
disingenuous.
normally call Southern hicks are all of a sudden just the greatest people
Yeah,
in the world to them. Or it, you know the story by now.
yeah, yeah. It's very tiresome. No one believes it. I mean, they are in an echo chamber when they say things like that, and it's just annoying to have to literally just put up with them. But yeah, I think it will be a story that'll be largely forgotten, and they've done this in the past. They've drudged up all kinds of insane stories about Russia. The whole point is that they have a public that's not going to read, that is going to be quick to judge Russia, that isn't going to ask, well, where's the evidence, or any other kind of measures of good journalism won't be asked. So um, because they're already on a side, so they just need their biases confirmed. And right now, I mean, it's really a buildup for what America has to do toward Russia post Trump. I mean, that's all this is, because those days are coming, I believe, where harsher actions will have to take place against Russia.
I mean, we'll get into it later as sort of
Yeah,
the to close out the show. But I mean, Russia's pretty much declared itself a civilization rather than a country at this point. So they're
yeah,
posturing to sort of like uh, pave their own future. Pave the path to their own future. But again, we'll touch on that again. I want to get into Libya because
yeah.
there's been some more events there. As we said, Turkey's been very successful. I believe that's what emboldened them to take the most recent actions they did in Syria. But the more interesting developments come between, I would say, inter-coalition contradiction. Now, I'll start with this before we get into the other thing. So, according to France 24, Macron is confident of progress in Russia ties after a video conference with Putin on Friday. And they
Mhm.
said the focal point was relations with each other and their cooperation on Libya. And you'll notice what France is doing is much of the French credibility in terms of the Libya scenario has been destroyed ever since the overthrow of Gaddafi. Because, yes, Obama was heavily involved in it, Hillary Clinton's State Department was heavily involved in it, but it was a French proposal and French led operation. It was a multilateral action, but again, the idea originated in France under Sarkozy, which that was sort of his parting gift to Hollande, I guess, and then now we have Macron. And even though Macron wasn't associated with either, heavily associated with either of those two administrations, just by leading the French state, the burden does fall on him. So, in order to influence anything in Libya, he has to ride in on the Russian coattails, and he has to cooperate with. I mean, I suppose he very well could have done the same thing, cooperating with Turkey, but in terms of French goals, there cooperating with Russia made more sense at the time. Now, maybe in a different paradigm, under a more establishment, under a more quote unquote normal world, we may have seen the inverse. But again, that's aside the point. But France has very little credibility left in Libya. Even the United States realizes that, which is why we cut our losses and left last year. Even the UK realizes that. Italy is just impotent at this point with all their internal issues and their economic crises. But as I said, Russia has earned a bit of a reputation in terms of stability in regards to its actions in Syria, which again prompted their, I would say, more hands-off involvement in Libya, soft support, and that of course leads to a building coalition with France, with Egypt, with again the Gulf states. They're a bit odd, but they tend to lean towards the pro Haftar side. And the reason I bring all this up is Haftar thanks France for their actions in Libya, while Macron denies the presence of French forces in Libya. So,
Yes, yes. Uh, Haftar, shut up. Yeah, I'm very sure Macron wishes he had never said that. Um, but I would say honestly, I mean, here's the way I see it. Macron is doing very poorly right now with local elections, and his presidency is in severe doubt. He may be on the way out, and that might not be all too long.
yeah,
Um,
next election 2022, and again, depending on who the opposition is, which isn't clear whether it's going to come from the further left or further right. In this case, I think coming from the further left from a socialist party would probably be better for him electorally, but again, I'll touch on that probably in a later episode.
mhm. Yeah, so he's not going to have the kind of support, and even his economic minister is actually more popular than he is, and this is the sort of the third man down in French politics. Um, I'm sure he's looking for kind of a Russia cover to all of this, so that he doesn't share the blame, because the blame will go on him, no matter what the French do in Libya from now on. And thanks to Sarkozy. So the other interesting bit of news, of course, is there was a run-in between uh, Turkish military ships and French military ships. There was some kind of altercation. Nothing serious happened. However, there was a planned a NATO exercise in the Mediterranean, which France has now declined to participate in. So NATO continues to see this kind of fracturing that's been going on in a very visible way since 2016. Um, and now it's more than just what Turkey may or may not do with reference to Syria and Russia, but now it's including directly other NATO countries other than Greece. So I would say that Macron wants very little publicity about this. I think he's very concerned about how much Turkish power is going to be had in the Eastern Mediterranean, and now this is basically the Central Mediterranean. Um, I think a lot of this has to deal with Erdogan's ability to turn, as much as anything else, to turn the migrant crisis off and on. Now, people will argue, well, there's boats coming from Libya all the time, anyways. Yes, that's true, but that there isn't a leader who's threatening to do that, right? Um, Erdogan can literally, um, you know what I mean? It's a leader who's making a direct threat and can deliver on it. He did it last time, and you saw the way the EU jumped on it. Yes, I know. The EU responded, NATO responded, well, mostly the EU. And that might have had something to do with COVID, but it was February. It was very early March. Many European countries were still not taking it very seriously then.
Well, I just think they didn't want Greece to
How,
implode because it was already on hard times before that, and another wave may have just broken them.
right,
And I would
right,
say that's still the
right. So
case.
there's yes, yes, and it is, and so it's also a sign of strength. And I think there's a lot of EU leaders who are now very resentful towards Turkey. Um, yeah, Macron, I think, wants at least to leave something of a positive legacy with just 2 years remaining. Now, there's probably other issues. There could be issues that have to deal with the energy sector. Interestingly, Russia took over an oil field in the southwest of the country with a different group other than the LNA, but is aligned with the LNA. And they propose to basically cut oil production, or those facilities that could be used by the GNA to garner basically dollars in order to support their regime. So that's a very interesting development. And, America's addressed this, but it hasn't addressed it head on.
Yeah, I
They've
was
given,
actually just about to get into that
their
piece by
disapproval,
Bloomberg.
but yeah,
Uh,
yes, yeah.
but you bring that up because I want to make that point, and then I'll start with this one first, and I'll close out with the Bloomberg thing on the Libya topic. I think a lot of what's going to happen in Libya is going to be contingent on whatever action Egypt takes, because Egypt threatened an invasion to put down, again, a Muslim Brotherhood-backed government. And I would take them pretty seriously on that claim, like I said, with someone like al-Sisi in power in Egypt.
Hmm.
He does not want a Muslim Brotherhood resurgence in Libya because that will inevitably spill over, and it won't take that long either, so
Yeah,
I think if
absolutely.
Egypt is proactive on this, they will have the full support of countries like France, like Russia, and they can do a lot of the heavy lifting, while France and I would say Russia, to a greater degree, France can take a more hands-off approach and a more plausibly deniable approach, sort of taking credit for successes while passing blame on failures.
I think even a country like Tunisia is afraid of spillover, given how destabilized they've been the last 2 years.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they've been. They were the cradle of the quote unquote Arab Spring, so I could see even some support for involvement by them. So, I mean, if they can get Egypt and or Tunisia on board with some sort of action in Libya, that would probably be best case scenario, and I imagine those negotiations are happening behind closed doors as we speak. So, I would still say I expect Egypt to send forces into the country at some point. Now, whether it will be a full invasion force or just a small contingent, time will tell. But I don't see a way. I don't see a possibility where they don't send them in.
Uh, I would tend to agree with you. I think that we might see. There's a very good chance we're going to see a diplomatic resolution to this. once the GNA sees that there's no way they can capture any more land, that they're landlocked, that they're, that the ability to create revenue from those, for instance, those oil fields that the Russians just took over, or the other oil fields that are in the northeast of the country that are controlled by the LNA. I think once they see that, all of this can be turned off because they really have just this very relatively small area. It looks like they control about 20-25% of the country, and it's in the northwest of the country. And
Yeah, it controls
it's
Tripoli, which is a vital city, admittedly, but again,
yeah.
compared to their position versus Haftar, and the fact that Haftar was within a footstep of completely crushing their movement just a year ago, this is probably, again, a similar case of what we see in Syria, where they're just trying to get a better position at the bargaining table for a shaky political resolution.
Hmm, hmm. Yeah, that's what I think. And part of it was that Haftar wasn't successful, but but the fact that they're still successful in defending Sistra probably, is gives the GNA more leverage at the moment to push for negotiations. But I don't see the GNA winning back Libya. That's not going to happen.
One way it could happen.
There's just too
I
many.
will say this. One way it could happen is Haftar is an aged man with health issues. If he were to die, I think they could get the
Mhm.
upper hand on him.
Oh, very good point. That's possible. That's possible.
He was actually airlifted into France for an emergency surgery last year. So it's, I mean, I think he's 76. He would have been 75 then.
Shh, keep it down. Don't.
Don't
Why
jinx it.
did you
Don't
have to
jinx it.
mention? Why couldn't you just say he was taken to a European hospital?
I know it was before France actually got too involved, believe it or not. But the last thing I want to cover on Libya is Bloomberg Opinion put out an article on Friday that Turkey had eclipsed Emmanuel Macron's Libyan dreams, and they made a pro-Turkish case, which again, playing by the old rules, playing by the rules of the current, now failing world order in terms of the authority of the United Nations, which however much that is worth, which I think sometimes it can be enough to shove something through. Now, is it what it once was? Absolutely not. But they can use it when they absolutely have to. Turkey can build a pretty solid case for intervention in Libya, backing a UN backed government, whatever, against the failures of France and Russia, who they can say has no business in Libya. So Turkey can make this case, and it's pretty much what they laid out in this Bloomberg article. But again, as I said, Western governments haven't come out and said it, specifically Anglosphere governments, which I was expecting the US and UK to tacitly back Turkish moves. But it seems like the Anglo American media outlets have taken that position, which, again, knowing what we know about a lot of these media outlets, especially Bloomberg, they're speaking on their behalf.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, some of it is just sour grapes. Some of it is because they literally cannot. While they may be from the French point of view on the same page with why Haftar should probably take over, and also from the perspective of the Egyptians, there might be, you could look at from that perspective why America would probably secretly be on their side. But I think, you know, in a sense, they can't afford to because they've so bought into this anti-Russia narrative that any victory by Russia from this point on is literally perceived like a kind of existential threat and a victory over America.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
even the 2000s to early 2010s neoconservatives and neoliberals conceded there were areas where the United States and Russia could cooperate for mutual gain. I mean, you go back as early as recent as 2014 with the Crimea crisis. I saw some prominent neoliberals. I can't remember who it was, but it was like I think a New York Times writer saying maybe Ukraine should be partitioned into a independent Western Ukrainian state and allow a more pro-Russia Eastern state. Imagine them trying to make that proposal now. Even as a
mhm.
neoliberal, even as somebody who supports the current world order, they would be driven out of town, quite literally.
Excellent point. Excellent point. It really has become that dire. They literally there's no flexibility whatsoever.
Yeah, even Reagan. big Cold Warrior had more flexibility in his negotiations with the Soviet Union than modern American diplomats and modern American politicians have with the current Russian Federation.
Right, and it's kind of interesting, because you could argue that one of the reasons why there was flexibility with Russia, or rather the Soviet Union at that time, was you could argue it was because it was strong, and that something had to be done. And so now maybe the messaging is because it's weak and you're just letting it get away with it.
Yeah,
I don't know.
it's not. I saw this point also when I would say more in 2015 when the war in Ukraine really started to pick up. Stop legitimizing Russia as a great power. They're nothing more than a third world country with nuclear weapons. Or again, it was these attempts to downplay the scale of Russia while treating it as a massive threat. Sort of this
Mhm.
this double think, which again they always have a way to justify, but I think they don't so much fear Russia's influence expanding, but the recognition of the Russian sphere of influence and them as a player on the world stage, which, I mean, pragmatically they function that way because, again, they can't just barge into Syria or barge into Libya or wherever, but rhetorically they haven't come to accept it.
Yeah, and I remember that there was a very, very interesting video from Bloomberg today back in, I believe it was April or May of 2014. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was talking to Carl Bloomberg. And Carl was furious with Russia being able to regain Crimea and said something, to the effect like, "What are we going to do? We have to do something." And, Brzezinski would just basically say, "Okay, name something. Sanctions." He goes, "That's not enough." He goes, "Well, there must be something. There's this thuggish behavior, so on and so on." So there was this kind of meltdown that was happening, and I think that was the event that Georgia in 2008 could be forgiven, it could be forgotten, but I think losing Crimea for the Americans was just it was I do to this day I think it was the pivotal event because it really would have completely tied up Russia. It really would have blocked them.
It was the
Uh,
checkmate, and Russia checked them.
yes, yes, and it didn't happen, and I think that's where all the fury comes from. If it had to be, I mean, it's never just one event, but if I had to choose one, that's the one.
Well, like I said, that's why I use the checkmate. Like, yeah, putting in terms of you reference Brzezinski, a chessboard. That's what it would have been, but that did
Yeah.
not come to fruition. So, uh, but I would agree that that is the focal point. That is people again. The trope goes the century doesn't actually start until about 15, 20 years into it. For example, the 20th century didn't really start until the end of World War One. I would say the 21st century didn't really start until Crimea rejoined Russia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even I would say even the tempo of life in the 21st century, in a way, 2020 reflects that more than any other year.
Yeah, in geopolitical terms and social and political terms, the 21st century began in the late 2010s.
Yeah.
That's what we're looking at here. Now, just real quick before we get into some stuff with Russia, since I know we teased that quite a bit, including just then, uh, Israel Palestine. We touched on this about a month and a half ago. There were talks of the impending West Bank annexation, and it seems like that's set to go through because that was the agreement of the unity government because they agreed to cooperate on emergency issues and day-to-day issues such as the coronavirus. So far, I don't know when these next Israeli elections are going to be, but I imagine there will be another election probably before the end of the summer, if I had to take a guess with the current trends in Israel. But the statements Israel has put out, it said West Bank annexation will proceed, but it won't be an immediate process. really tiptoeing around it, and of course that follows the scrutiny of Western Europe and the United Nations, and of course some factions within the Anglosphere, even though the Anglosphere is more solidly pro-Israel than not. The finger wagging from Western Europe, from Macron, from even Boris Johnson at this point, which I thought was a bit surprising, while they take no substantive action against the annexation of West Bank territory. So the story we've seen time and time again, and I'm curious if something will come to light, and keep an eye on Syria for this matter. If there's some great gain for Assad's forces, or some outmaneuvering in Idlib or wherever, or even Daraa, which things have picked up in, perhaps Russia and Israel cut a deal in regards to West Bank for more breathing room in Syria. That would be my speculation, but again, that's too early on to say because, again, I don't think there was the UN vote yet, but we're at the deadline, so it's definitely approaching. And it's generally accepted that despite all the condemnations, despite everything, the West Bank will be annexed. But again, Israel tempers that with saying, well, it's not going to be right away, and we're going to do it this way and this way. And really, I would say what we're looking at is another kicking of the can down the road.
Yeah, and also there has, I mean, I don't know if even Israelis are aware of it. I presume some are, that, one of the functions of the dispute in Israel-Palestine is really just to demonstrate to the world what Israelis can do and get away with. And that extends all the way to Western countries basically fetching about what Israel is doing, but helpless to do anything to counter them. And yet, you know, if you look at this issue a little bit more in depthly, and as we've discussed on previous shows about Finkelstein and Netanyahu, they were very concerned, and they wanted in Mitt Romney a leader that was going to give a lot of red meat, to uh, let's say racist conservatives or white nationalists, the poorest border, the most porous border in the world. Uh, in order to get a president that would be effective for the kind of things that Israel wanted to achieve. And so it is actually a serious thing with them. I'm just sort of going off here because in a way, like what they're demonstrating is this kabuki theater, in a sense, kind of makes them look strong. So, it's not really, uh, it's not really that bad from their point of view. Of course, they're always afraid of optics and how it's going to be looked at. I'm sure they have other Israeli Jews who are very concerned, why Netanyahu has propped up, right-wing nationalist leaders uh, in Eastern Europe. That could be looked at as a danger in the long run for them. But the way I see it, nothing has ever been done in all these decades. Boris Johnson has been published in an Israeli newspaper condemning what Israel is doing. But let's face it, nothing is going to happen. And yes, that can make Israel look like a pariah, but it also makes Israel look kind of strong.
Yeah, it's purely. Now, there are strategic interests from the point of view of the Israelis in the West Bank, less so Gaza in terms of arable land, access to water, whatever. But a lot of their moves towards annexation is a projection of force, saying, we can do it to them, why can't we do it to you? It shows a message, yeah, we can act however we want. Okay, maybe that's a bit an exaggeration, but we can take these aggressive actions. We have a lot of support behind us, and what are you going to do? And that sends a message to countries like Iran, like Syria, even to outside players like Russia or anyone else who wants to get involved in the region. Now, I'm curious to see a timeline, and I think we are heading towards this timeline where there inevitably will be a Turkish Israeli diplomatic row.
Hmm.
You actually
Hmm.
go back, I don't know, about a year ago. Colonel Douglas McGregor, who I haven't mentioned on the show in quite some time, but probably one of the best analysts of the current geopolitical world. I'm sure you've seen him on Tucker Carlson. He does a lot of the news programs. Really preaches a very constrained, pragmatic approach to geopolitical issues, especially in the Middle East. Very popular with his talks on Iran. But point being is, look him up. He's got a lot of interesting stuff. He's written quite a few books too. But his prediction is that there will eventually come a time, especially if the U.S. takes a more hands-off role in the Middle East, as we've somewhat seen under Trump, where Turkey and Israel will eventually come into not direct conflict, but come into a dispute with each other. And
Yeah.
I mean, especially if both Erdogan and Netanyahu are in power, or somebody who are akin to them, because I think they both have a pretty stable hold over the countries. Maybe Netanyahu much less so, but the clashing of those personalities in charge of those two particular countries, that is going to be a mess. And oh boy, like that's going to be a harsher sort of rivalry than I would say even Israel and Iran at this point.
Yeah, and Erdogan has made these anti-Israel postures before. They've been in contradiction with some of his other policies that are part of, having good terms with Israel. But he has, the ships that were headed toward Palestine to the Gaza Strip for relief. People died in the first confrontation, and there were problems with the second confrontation as well. And he fully understands that his support does come from traditional Muslims who are coming from the extreme east of Anatolia and the southeast of Anatolia, and who have moved into Istanbul, right? I mean, they're the ones who literally, saved them from being cooked like a goose. So back in 2016, so he has to look strong, and you could argue that Turkey, compared to 10 years ago, is actually a stronger country
Oh yeah,
with
and
with with more influence and more power, more intimidation in the Middle East and in the Eastern Mediterranean than like really like in a very long time that I can remember.
I mean they've definitely exploited their geography as the pivot point of the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. So, and Erdogan, if he's going to do this what could broadly be called neo-Ottomanism sort of LARP. Again, you remember the Ottoman
Hmm.
slap,
Yeah, I do.
all that sort of stuff. If he wanted to poise himself as something of a defender of Islam, he could very easily have a reason to take a strong Palestinian stance or a strong stance in Iraq or Syria or against even the Iranians in terms of the Sunni Shia conflict. So he is actually in a very good position in terms of the Middle East to really start projecting Turkish power. Not that he already hasn't, but look, there were some unstable times for him a few months ago, about a year ago, but I think Turkey is becoming a force to be reckoned with, not only in the Middle East, but in its entire like cross-regional area in terms of its negotiations with Russia, its negotiations with Europe. I think I wouldn't go this far, but I think Turkey, if they really apply themselves over the next few decades, could form sort of a neo-Ottoman empire, a Ottoman power block, if you will, to the
Mm.
point where they have the leverage to deal with the greater powers of the world.
Right, and just to reflect again on his base, these women and men, they go to the shrines in Istanbul of the generals and some of the better known officers of the Ottoman Empire of who went over the walls of Constantinople and fought and died in order to capture Constantinople. They have shrine upon shrine of these men and that they worship at, right? And it's sort of like their privilege to be in Istanbul and pray there.
Yeah, their
And
tombs are like national monuments at this point.
that's right. And again, we have the issue about what to do with the Hagia Sophia. Now he's going to be, I think, very clever and political about this, about whether to turn it back into a mosque or not. right? But then there's also the question with Israel, which is a separate question altogether. But I do believe they tie in with with respect to soft power and how it's negotiated, right? Um, he's very able right now, if he wanted to create the image of a strong Muslim leader that other Muslim countries, even if they're not Turkish, of course, if they're Arabic, can rally behind him in a way that's different than the Turkish Empire, right? They have more autonomy. They don't have to speak Turkish in order to advance in their societies, and so on and so on and so on. And ultimately, Israel is going to want to get rid of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's obvious, right? It can begin with building a synagogue next to it, but ultimately they want that shrine gone. And he has to know that. And he has to know the kind of political importance he can have if he remains as leader. So it's not just, you know, going over one city to sack it and claim it as your own. It's about kind of defending one that you lost.
Absolutely,
To
and
look at it from a very broad historical point of view.
yeah, and as we'll get into with Russia, we're seeing the formation of civilizational states, and people talk about Russia, people talk about what's going on there, people talk about some of Macron's moves and the rhetoric that Trump has espoused and some of these other Western European populists. But I think an overlooked one in terms of forming a civilizational state is Turkey is very much in the thick of that. They play the way they conduct themselves is they behave as if they were an empire. Now, of course, within their means, but nonetheless, they are behaving as if they are the Ottoman Empire, and it's not. I would say it's not entirely unfounded because they've done so to great success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, with that, I suppose we can move
I mean,
in.
just as a follow up,
Yes,
according
continue.
to Carl Bloomberg,
Oh,
he had a direct line to Blumf, and he would call him during the times that Blumf was playing golf. I just, I'm sorry, but I just love that. Apparently, there
Jared,
was also
Jared, are you telling me that Turkey's calling me again? Oh yes, Donald.
yeah,
But
and
reenactment.
apparently, yes, apparently, apparently, there was a chat between Erdogan and Putin. Putin said he gave the Syria away like the whole store, or he gave away the whole store in Syria.
Oh boy.
Anyways, I don't personally believe a lot of this. I wish it were true. Anyhow,
Yeah,
but I do believe he did have more of a direct line to Trump.
yeah. I definitely believe that, and Erdogan and Trump's relationship has been interesting since the beginning. But again, with that out of the way, let's move into Russia, where the constitutional reforms passed with a 76 to 24% vote. Now, of course, the shriekings of voter fraud and voter suppression came out almost immediately, and this is just Putler trying to stage a coup to stay in power for life, like he hasn't already been there for life. But point being is, what happened was the main cruxes of it is the social issues with the not only look, gay marriage wasn't a thing in Russia before this, but now it is constitutionally barred from becoming a thing. It would take another constitutional amendment in order to even allow it.
Mhm.
They enshrine that they are a state of, based on God. Now, they took a more religiously neutral stance than I would have liked them to see. Now, again, that's to appease like the like
Muslims.
7% Muslim population and the small but influential Jewish population they have, and of course the overwhelming majority Christian population they have. So again, they took it, but I mean, I'd take a religiously neutral stance on. Yes, we're a religious state over what they had before, what we have currently in the West. They they stated the Russians as a quote nation forming people, sort of the core of this new civilizational state as it's been dubbed. Now, not by any official documentations, but that's what it's become known as in common parlance, both here and across the world. So it has that. It has the formation of an ethnic group, and as part of that, they barred those from they barred those who've lived outside the country and held foreign residency from seeking and holding office. And then the other one, which is the one that the media is really focusing on, is that they re-amended the presidential term limits to the point where Putin can now have 2 more terms. Now, I think the term limits still exist. It's just the point that it's a fresh reset, so he can still serve in those terms, which that would theoretically put him in power until 2036. Now, whether he'll stay around that long, I don't know. I doubt it. I'm
Mhm.
sure there's some success in the wings that we just don't know about. But point being is, I see in these past few years until 2024 and maybe another term after that, whatever, he's probably going to start taking more of a hands-off role and passing the torch, if you will. You saw that with some of the electoral and parliamentary reforms, putting the power more in the parliament than the presidency and putting more power into the cabinet. So we could see it in that direction where he's a more hands-off elder statesman sort of figure. But point being is, this passed overwhelmingly, and I would guess that was mainly on the more social issues and possibly the idea of a nation forming people on the ethnic issues than it was on the actual electoral reforms. Now, that's the idea I've got. That's the idea I've gotten from the few Russians I've seen talk about this. But it's definitely a step in the right direction. I don't think it goes far enough in plenty of places, but again, in terms of a backlash against the dominance of liberalism, I would say this is probably one of the biggest events in the past few years.
Yes, this is definitely a very giant step in the right direction. So I find one of the things that I heard initially was they were going to scrap the whole dual citizen thing, which I think was literally one of the most important things to have in the list of amendments. So now government employees and politicians cannot have dual citizenship.
Or even have
That's
held dual
incredible.
residency.
Right, right. So we, we don't have to elaborate why that's so awesome.
Yeah.
This is this is
Are you
gonna
saying
piss
certain
off.
oligarchs go abroad and gain their capital there and use to influence internal Russian politics? Yeah, it's that never happened in the 1990s. That was all just exaggerated. No, never, none of it. But continue.
Right, he's barred them from coming back. But furthermore,
If
what he's
only, if
also
only.
done is suppose they want to finance somebody, let's say another Navalny, another like nobody. And what they would have to do is they'd have to find like this, as you say, this nation building Slavic Russian guy who would be willing to take back these amendments to switch everything around. That will look very, very unpatriotic. Also, I think if he doesn't run in 2024, I think the whole purpose of these amendments is basically to safeguard that what he's worked for in unwritten terms continues to go on thereafter. Right? That's the whole point of it, is that you've separated yourself from the West distinctly enough. You've managed to keep your country afloat despite all these challenges. You've integrated with the biggest emerging economy in the world, right? There are still many, many problems, but the threat of pause is a very real thing, and you have to do something about that. Um, and of course, this comes on the heels of very similar measures being put into law in Romania, in Hungary, and in Poland, right? So this kind of civilizational separation between Eastern Europe and Western Europe is only sharpening. And you can see, like woke culture, well, woke culture is just the latest Western European culture. It's the one that's accepted. It's the one that no one seems to have a cogent argument against or a coherent argument against, right? People can dislike it, people can find a hypocrisy, but they don't have actually an ideology that can supplant, that can replace it. So he's increasing that distinction, and this is also why I bring up the why I brought up the Bloomberg Brzezinski meeting, is because Bloomberg had said in this interview that the year before, that I always said Russia was an existential threat. And so did Brzezinski, and he says not even in a militaristic way, but in a cultural way, Russia presents a threat to Europe and the EU. Now, 6-7 years later, you can see what they were afraid of.
Yeah, and
Right. Yeah.
in terms of Russian leaders that have existed, in terms of world leaders that have existed in general, Putin is really nothing special except the fact that he just stands out from his contemporaries, I would say. And I would say that's the same case for the Russian state, because the Russian state does have a lot of problems that are being addressed, admittedly, to a degree at least. But I think for all his faults, Putin, as you said, he sort of kept the country just, neck above the water sort of state, and he garnered a lot of criticism for not going further. Crimea boosted some support for him, boosted more confidence in him, but even after that, he still got criticized from a lot of the not going far enough from a lot of the further right and more nationalistic Russians. And I think we were discussing this, that this is the crunch time for Putin in terms of now he needs to make his final moves to cement his legacy, to cement a Russia in the image of what could probably be called illiberalism. I think the constitutional amendments are a first good step. I think his integration with non-Western economies is another good step, and even appeals to, I guess, say what would be like-minded groups in the West, such as some of these more populistic parties in Italy and France and wherever. Even his initial warm feeling towards Trump and Brexit, you could argue that. But
Hmm.
what we have right now, again, is he's putting those moves into place, and I think this does bode well for him institutionalizing a lot of what he's established, or rather preserved, because again, the example a lot of people go to, and I like to go to, is look at the regimes of Franco and Salazar. Probably some of the most coherent and sane regimes in Europe over the 20th century, both pre and post war. Now,
Hmm.
look what happens immediately after both those men die. Uh, their countries, Portugal and Spain, are completely consumed by vultures. Now, there's undercurrents. It's funny, you especially see in Spain, there's still a lot of Francoist undercurrents, at least nostalgia for the regime and memorial foundations for him and whatever. But again, it's not like they hold any significant political or institutional power. I'm not saying he's learning from their mistakes exactly, but I think in a broad sense it could be, say, it's as if he's learning from the mistakes of those who established regimes that are going against the tide for their times. Because, again, the minute Franco died, the minute Salazar died, the vultures were already circling for years before. They were working on integration into Spain and Portugal. They were working on these economic deals and these military alliance deals, and even Portugal joining NATO under Salazar. But point being is, I think Russia's in a uniquely different position because there had been that break from the West over the Ukraine issue, over Crimea, over a myriad of different issues, Syria, now more recently Libya, and
Hmm. Hmm.
I think what has been done is he has secured that, and I'm not saying his work can't fall apart. I'm not saying it won't fall apart. I'm not saying we won't get another Boris Yeltsin. I think it's unlikely, but I think he's created a pretty good shield against all that could last at least a little bit after he goes, to the point where hopefully some more competent successor can not only preserve but continue his work. And like I said, there's probably somebody waiting in the wings that we just don't know about. But again, even if there's not, there's still a institutional basis in place to the point where it won't all fall apart if there's a moment of destabilization.
Right. He's the other thing that he's done is, instead of the idea of, in a way, right? What makes, say, Russia different than Spain is, like, he's not trying to recapture lost institutions, right? Because in many ways, those institutions have been destroyed twice over. You know, you know, um, during the Russian Revolution, and then after the end of communism, and so on. So, in a way, what he's doing is he's building a kind of momentum within these institutions. He's giving them kind of a new purpose, not just a new purpose, but he's given them a new ideology, right? He's fleshing that out. And that ideology is going to become predominant. And going against that ideology in an open way in Russia from now on is going to hurt you very badly, right? Um, and this is, I mean, we see it in the States, right?
I
It's
mean, I was just
inexorable.
about to say he's learned a lesson from his neoliberal counterparts, and that's probably because a lot of his early career was trying to fit in with them. But
Right,
look, I'm not
right.
not to sing the praise of Putin too much, but I think he learned a lot from them and applied them in a way that would be palatable to Russia, for better and for worse. And to the point where we get this sort of arrangement where, like, oh yeah, it turns out that this sort of soft authoritarianism, where yeah, you can go against these ideas, but will ruin your life for it. I think he's successfully imported that to Russia with a lot of these reforms. Which, again, for better and for worse, I think if a system is being upheld, if a system is actually working for the people, there is good reason to punish people for going outside of it. But again, that's my own personal authoritarian opinion. And continue.
Right. And I think going forward, the number one thing he's got to do is deal with economic reforms, justice reforms. He's got to take care of the domestic front right now. Um, I'm not sure that conflicts in Libya and Syria are going to be solved by 2024. That's worrisome. His only guarantee, I think, if suppose they're not solved, that he can continue the work, is that there is a definite improvement of the lives of Russians in the next 4 years, uh, while maintaining the current status quo in Syria and Libya, but particularly Syria, much more so than Libya. Libya is much less consequential.
Yeah,
So if
and
he can do,
I
if he can manage to do that, if he can improve the situation for the average Syrian and the average Russian, right? Uh, then I think he can exit 2024. If he can't, then he has to show momentum that he is actually achieving that, which will mean a kind of new creative policies that will have to be tied with that have to be created with China and Iran to work more effectively as a unit.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think with the modern state of the West, Russia should be weary of increased cooperation, even under more sane governments. For example, if we do get a more nationalistic, more right wing government in France, again, that's only bound to last so long in a so-called democracy. But I do think there are open avenues of opportunity in Europe with the rise of what could broadly be described as populist and anti-establishment candidates. I do think, again, I don't think it's a surefire thing. I think, like Russia, like all countries, should not put all its eggs in one basket, whether that be cooperation with China and Iran, whether that be cooperation with various European Union states or whoever. But point being is, I think even if you could score some diplomatic victories in Europe, and again, we've seen this Orban, we see this increasingly with France, that might also be a positive. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think detente is on the table. I think things have soured too far between the West and Russia to the point where if Putin's sitting down and negotiating some sort of a friendly terms with the United States or any other Western power, I really don't think that's politically palatable right now because just of the growing sentiments in each country. But beyond that, I think what we have is workable. I think what the Russians have is workable more appropriately. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm generally optimistic about this, and I'm hoping not only for Russia, but it will cause a ripple wave. Like you said, we've seen this in Eastern Europe, with Hungary really at the forefront, Poland, Romania, and these other countries taking a secondary role. But I hope maybe it's a long shot. It can seep its ways into some parts of Western Europe that aren't too far gone socially, such as, I don't know, maybe you think parts of a rural France where, I mean, France, believe it or not, actually has more conservative attitudes than you think. Now, of course, they're the bastion of liberalism in the modern world, French Revolution, all that stuff. We can get into that. But point being is, I think there's enough undercurrent where they can still offer a pushback in the West. Italy, we've seen, again, with the success of some of the more right wing parties, and even Germany, which Merkel made some interesting comments, which we'll probably get into next week because of time constraints, and we'll see how those play out. But I do, I am hoping not only in a political way, but in a cultural way, this can reverberate. And you see, as negative opinions on Russia get lower and lower every year, People are more open to
Interesting.
them. So I think Russia, despite all its internal issues, is in a position again to build its civilizational state, if you will. Now, maybe, and I personally think maybe the cooperation and inroads in Western Europe are a bit too optimistic. Maybe a mutual understanding of each other, a sort of non-aggression pact, because the last one for Russia worked out so well. Uh,
Right.
but I think you get my point. Sort of a more non-aggression parts with some Western countries, arguably even the United States, depending on who's in power, whether it's a more hawkish candidate like Biden or whether it's somebody who is more weary of foreign entanglements, as much as an American president can be. But time will tell with a lot of these things. But I think this is at least enshrined something where Russia can fall back on it if they don't have a strong man at the ready.
Yeah, I think that's essentially its purpose. I also think, just in sort of other news than the amendments concerning Russia is, and you kind of touched on it with regards to Germany, is that um, Germany now is, because there's a rotation, Germany is now head of the EU. But more importantly, Merkel has come out and said that the EU must prepare for in the future for a time where America is no longer the global leader and adjust accordingly. The other thing is another article appeared in Germany where both parties are against the possible sanctions against Germany should Germany continue with Nord Stream 2. So, America is very powerful, and you can see that, wokeism and the unanimity of wokeism across the West is a way of solidifying and signaling American power, and there can be no deviation from it. It's a it really is kind of like a soft version of, I hate to say it, but Russia during the Soviet era. Um, there can be no deviation from this, and America will sanction these countries, and it's going to be very interesting to see what happens the next 2 months.
Yeah, and like you said, I think it's actually a pretty apt comparison that we've fallen in the same trap with our so-called allies the Soviet Union did with the Warsaw Pact. Because admittedly, you can be dominant over other countries, but you gotta walk a fine line. Because if you push too far, we all saw what happened in the Warsaw Pact. Now America is still, I would say, in a much better position than
Yeah.
to face revolts in Western Europe. It's a much more hands-off sort of imperial government where again, you won't see American tanks putting down riots in France, even though in an indirect way, we're probably helping the French put down those yellow vest riots from a year ago. But again, if that would have again, if there would have been riots like that in Poland or Romania during the Soviet era, there would have been Soviet troops directly involved in putting that sort of thing down. Just to paint a
Mm,
contrast of what we're looking at, sort
absolutely.
of the more
Absolutely.
head-on domination of other countries versus the backdoor domination, if you will, the leading from behind. Which, funny enough, the leading with behind is some of the most insidious imperialism there is, despite the conservative criticism of it. But that's all I had to say for this episode. We do plan on recording a special episode again on the riots, on the protests, on the social state of America. I imagine election issues will come up in that at some point, either tomorrow or over the weekend. Hopefully, we'll have that out on Monday at the latest. So, thank you everyone for tuning in. It's been quite an
Thanks, guys.
episode, and we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Take care.